Okay, my name's Imran Ali. It's always a treat to be part of Wuthering Bites. I did get to, thank you, Michelle, actually, for inviting me. I got to speak about Leeds' desire to be a kind of Silicon Valley type community last year, but what I wanted to discuss this year is part of a community storytelling program called Para Archive that I've been involved with at the University of Leeds. I wanted to reflect on the design and technology approach that we'd taken, but more importantly, maybe the insights that we discovered in getting individuals working together using public resources. It's slightly outside the definition, I think, for your theme today, but I kind of thought there might be some interesting insights there to share.
It all fits.
I'll make it. So I'm one of the founders of Carbon Imagineering, a digital innovation and R&D practice. Much of our work explores the implications of emerging technologies and how new opportunities can be crafted from quite disruptive innovations. I've worked in and around this area for about 15 years in evil multinationals, venture-backed startups, R&D labs, and actually recently in arts and culture organisations, one of which is IOU Theatre based here in Calderdale. So back in autumn 2012, I was introduced to an academic from the University of Leeds, from the School of Communications and Media. It was part of a matchmaking program that brought together academics and creative technologists to try and discover and identify new areas of research. And you'd think that a university would be quite naturally geared towards doing that, but they really wanted to invite in some external influence. So over the course of 4 caffeine and cake-fueled afternoons, we deliberated and ideated on storytelling, on memory, institutional archives, journalism, personal collections of media, and where technology was enabling and disrupting all these things. It was really interesting to work with a School of Humanities disciplines as well, because it really brought a different perspective to a lot of the design and engineering work that I'd done in the past, but also allowed us to kind of explore things that we wouldn't necessarily get the opportunity to do so, like ethical discussions. So from the conversations that we had during the course of that matchmaking exercise, we created a concept called Para Archive, an app for exploring stories about the London riots. We actually toyed with a few different collections of public stories. One was the Operation U Tree, but we arrived at the London riots because it would allow us to pick at a lot of different cultural and technological areas. The name alludes to parallel and archives, and it's a name that I hate, so we rebranded that quite quickly. I'll talk about that later. But essentially, we wanted to use a design concept to bring together social media, open data, people's personal perspectives about particular historical events, along with large institutional archives and collections, and essentially create a new digital public space. More importantly than a concept design, this matchmaking exercise helped us surface a few key principles that we hoped would guide a larger research project that would take place over a longer time frame. So our digital public space focused on narrative rather than truth. It allowed users to orchestrate pieces of media from across the web, respect the original sources, and we hope would allow an emerging fabric of connected stories to emerge around a particular issue, in this case, the London riots. But it was really a pilot project, what we were doing here, and that helped us unlock funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, bringing together the academics that we were working with, but also public institutions like the BBC and the Science Museum, who were curious about how they might unlock their vast archives for more kind of interesting audiences and usages. And we also started to work with local communities around the country to try and understand what individuals and people might actually do with that material. Oops. So up until that point, we'd been using fictional personas. If any of you are familiar with co-design or service design, as Catherine is, that's quite an understood thing. So we wanted to start actually working with real people and real stories. We put together a series of small co-design workshops with the communities that we'd recruited across the country. And it became quickly really apparent that we had access to a really remarkably committed and passionate bunch of people that represented all kinds of perspectives and age groups. These included archaeologists on the island of Bute, potteries and ceramics communities in Stoke-on-Trent. Now I know why the football team is called the Potters. And as well as filmmaker and hacker communities in Manchester. a really rich landscape of narratives that we could pick out and try and understand what sort of fabrics might emerge. So interestingly, the design team, the guys that I brought in to work on this project, we were from backgrounds where we used to designing for millions of users and working at ISPs or large brands. So it was actually quite a privilege to be able to design for a dozen users, people that weren't abstract rows in a database, but real personalities, with emotions and desires and flaws, and we got to hang out with them in quite an extensive and intimate way. And this meant that care, empathy, and respect became as crucial as our design approaches. And actually, in hindsight, it's apparent they were actually our design materials for delivering this project. So interestingly, many of the communities were people in their late middle age or early old age, generally familiar with computers, but maybe less comfortable with the cultures around publishing and online sharing. But we did have to balance our needs to move those workshops forwards without prejudicing with our existing ideas about the web. So it was a slow process, but it meant that it was one that was really deeply collaborative. So after each workshop, we'd take time to decompress and reflect on the findings that we had, capturing as much material as we could in conversation with the community members, and looking for patterns and connections, particularly mapping characters, people, and time frames that story took place to formulate a bunch of ideas that we could test in the next round of discussions. This involved a lot of mind-bending post-it physics. I've seen things done with post-it notes that no human should experience. But pen and paper became our kind of default tool for working with lots of people. Unsurprising to many people that work in digital, but actually the most natural way of thinking about a lot of the complex web of stories that we had. So around spring last year, we started to reflect on what the smallest unit of anybody's story could possibly be. Essentially, it's atoms or DNA, or whatever metaphor you want to use. How are they going to be created? How are they going to be discovered, connected, and shared? We started to think about story blocks, personal or archival media abstractions like people, places, times, and what kind of tools you might need to orchestrate them into interesting narratives. So we arrived at the block being almost a passage to which you could attach metadata, all kinds of media. But we wanted to make sure that that media could come from institutional archives, the partners that we were working with, but also the open web and people's own personal collections, whether they were digital in origin or not. And that would start enabling rich connections to form amongst otherwise unconnected stories, the kind of tapestries that we'd always imagined might emerge when we started the project. So our communities in Scotland and Stoke really embraced this, and actually it really wasn't a surprise because they'd co-invented it. One of the interesting comments that came back from the people that we worked with, that it felt like a project that was done with them rather than done to them, which is quite a revelation for us. We didn't think we were doing anything particularly unique in talking to them, but clearly there was an approach and a philosophy that really resonated with a lot of people. So we quickly moved from using paper models to creating an early digital prototype to see if the stories that were being related to us could inhabit the kind of block metaphor that we were thinking about and honor their original narratives. So that first prototype allowed us to move forward on designing some detailed storyboards. That's me messing around with Marvel movies to try and see if I could get kind of rich connection of characters and scenes. We started to think more about intuitive flows and interaction between features, and much of that work focused on how users might describe characters, places, and times to connect passages together. And when I say characters, that's real people rather than fictional constructs. So we're now at a stage where we could structure those findings from a prototype into a cohesive app and a glossary of features, which is the more kind of traditional software-oriented approach. But it had taken us something like 6 to 7 months out of an 18-month project to get to this point. So we really indulged ourselves in listening and connecting with the people that we were hoping to serve. We could also start moving beyond the storytelling features and start to consider how themed catalogues of archive material might be represented from our partners in the Science Museum and the Media Museum. and the BBC, 3 organisations which I really came to loathe by the end of this project. I can tell you about the politics of working with collection owners in the Q&A. So broadly speaking, we organised the features that we discovered into 3 groups. Firstly, the reading experience. How would people discover and consume stories? What would they look like? We did have a debate about whether we wanted kind of branching interactive stories that allowed a user to pick a path through a bunch of stuff. But we really quickly realised that wasn't how a lot of our community members were seeing their lives. They were very kind of linear, and that's actually really how we think about biographies and history. So we chose not to offer sort of branching storylines and structures. The second set of features that we concentrated on was how would our users collect and orchestrate material from their own collections, from the public web, and really the metaphor that we had was almost like a playlist of material from around the web. We wanted small pieces of the web to be loosely orchestrated into something that mattered to those individuals creating a story. And then lastly, the last set of features was how our archive partners' collections and catalogues would be created, curated, managed, and maintained. This became the most challenging part of the project, largely because institutions at that scale, even though they're trying to embrace more nimble means of working, they're really not equipped at a human level to do that. And actually we discovered that a lot of the motivations they didn't quite align with ours. We were about trying to empower and democratize access to stuff, and we really quickly got the sense that large institutions might talk about that, but they don't necessarily live it in their day-to-day values. As we move from the prototype to developing a richer beta version, we also faced a number of engineering challenges. We were working with an unfamiliar software framework, but we knew it would give us great flexibility and agility in changing direction if we needed to, but we had to learn that from scratch. The interaction design that our community members had created with us was elegant and simple, but it required a database and a logic core that was really complex and had to anticipate all kinds of unexpected behaviours. So somebody might start telling a story, somebody might collect a bunch of media and start telling a story around it. And we had to make sure that all of those different paths through the features that we'd developed could work in a sensible manner. And then lastly, we tried to build some clever story analysis tools that could look at a piece of text and tell you the characters that were in it, the places that it took place and how it might connect. Automating it was, we thought that might take some of the burden off some of our storytellers and community members, but actually it just wasn't consistent enough. The reason I mention all of this is because of the time frame that we had to work in over 18 months, we could try all kinds of different approaches, and we could try them very directly with the people we wanted to serve without fear of failure. And it's not often you get a luxury to do that in projects of this scale. So the last significant area of work was to develop a brand that reflected the journeys that everybody took in putting this project together. Archives are just one part of the stories users were attempting to tell, but we also wanted to provide a voice for myths, tales and rumours as much as historical and archaeological research. So we wanted a brand that conveyed storytelling but not veracity, and one that underlined the connectedness that we hoped a lot of these stories might have. So we arrived at Yarm. Like a lot of the ideas of this project, we're not entirely sure who came up with it. It was such a collaborative effort. But it was a brand that really seemed to embody all of our hopes and insights. And it honoured the contributions of everybody involved, conveyed the very human values that were at the core of how we designed this, but also returned us to the original principles of a fabric of connected tales. And fundamentally, our yarns aren't simply on the web, but they're of the web. They're made from the fabric of the web. And it was really important for us to convey that through the brand work that we did. So we're still polishing it, but it is available for you all to play with. There's an early public beta that's been around for a few months. Although the final release is sort of penciled in for October, you can go and poke around at people's existing stories, the collections of their own media that they've put together, but also try telling stories of your own. We were actually just at the V&A this last weekend at the London Design Festival, showing yarn as part of the Digital Design Weekend. So for something that's quite a humble piece of software, it's having an impact that we didn't really anticipate. So it isn't a profoundly innovative app. You've seen things like Medium, Blogger, all kinds of publishing tools that are out there. But it's very difficult to design something that really gives a sense of the people that created it. So that was one of our key motivations. So in that sense, Yarm's a really human scale project because it was designed for dozens of users rather than millions. But we think that the principles that we articulated scale up to serve all kinds of people, and we're starting to detect that as we get more public about the work. A lot of us that were involved in project talk about the empathy, care and listening that was a large part of the design process, but we're not really certain how you codify that for the future. How do you turn that into a methodology? The closest I've come to that, there's a book I think it was written in 1998 called Deep Hanging Out, which sort of sums up the philosophy that we had, a kind of immersive anthropology, which is generally things that you don't learn as a software engineer or a designer. They're very kind of new concepts. But we want to do a little bit more work to unpack some of that and understand, is this a better way of creating large-scale services as well as human scale? It does require generosity and patience with a lot of time to allow for experimentation and actually for reflection to understand the meaning and purpose of what you're doing. Qualities that aren't really readily part of a lot of digital projects. We get asked a lot about the business models and sustainability. As a university project, the instinct is to spin it out, get some funding and grow it and scale it very quickly. But given the nature of how this thing was created, and we're actually quite keen to look at a community-owned infrastructure, where the people that created it and are working on it and that will create content and technology for it in the future all get to understand, all get to be part of the ownership and the value that's created, but also preserving a lot of stories for eras that might last more than a lifetime. So that's the story of Yarm, tale of collaborative design and community storytelling. These slides are available on Yarm if you follow that link. Thanks very much. And if anyone has any questions.
Brilliant.